Amen. Now, for those of you that might be wondering why we didn't hear the screen go down, it's because I'm going to need it at the end of the service. So just trust me, we're going to need it, all right? So anyway, I want you to take your Bible and open to 2 Samuel and find chapter 9. Some of you realize that today is what has been called for the last nearly 40 years, Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. This is a Sunday that's been set aside over the last over 40 years for us to be reminded of how important life really is. And every year since 1982, when I became the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Baker, Montana, every year on the third Sunday of January, I like to remind us of how important life is. And there are times that over these many years I have been really very direct about the subject of pro-life and abortion and those kinds of things. Sometimes we've looked at subjects like adoption and the alternatives and all of the rest of it. And as I was looking ahead in the calendar and as I was trying to when I was asking the Lord what I should do for this particular Sunday, the Lord said to me, well, why do you need to leave 2 Samuel? I mean, you talked last week about the bookends of the wars and all in chapter 8 and chapter 10. And right in the middle is this wonderful story of David and Mephibosheth. Why would you want to go anywhere else? Because actually the story of David and Mephibosheth demonstrates that David had a value on human life beyond anything of his contemporaries would normally have had. So it seemed to me, why leave 2 Samuel? So this morning we're going to stay within our study through the life of King David, and we're going to use 2 Samuel 9. We are going to study 2 Samuel 9, but we will do it from a different perspective than I might have done if we were in 2 Samuel 9 in June or July, because today I want to very specifically think about how David's actions demonstrated his value of human life. I want you to follow with me. I'm going to read the entire chapter, all 13 verses, and I want you to just again follow this chapter. Then David said, is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show my chesed, my kindness, for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, there's still a son of Jonathan who's crippled in both feet. So the king said to him, well, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. And the king sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, here is your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you will eat at my table regularly. Again he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant that you would regard a dead dog like me? And the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all of his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. Now, he was lame in both feet. Again, this morning, I need you and I to think about what it is in our lives, both individually, corporately, communally. I want us to ask ourselves the question, what is it that we value? What is it that we put the greatest value? What do we think is the most worthy thing in our lives? I listed for myself a number of things that people count extremely valuable. Love, success, freedom. Again, we saw that played out yesterday. It blew up Twitter and Facebook, and again, I didn't watch any of the news reports really, but the world could not get over the fact that Iran had released these prisoners, and there was great joy. There was to be that. I'm not suggesting that these things do not have value, but some of us value freedom the greatest of anything. Connections, security, passion, trust, well-being, things like significance, position. There are all kinds of things that we value. There are all kinds of things that in our world we have decided are worth a life of commitment to. We have decided that it's worthwhile to give our time, effort, and money to. And once again, in this week alone, we saw a huge movement to what people actually value. It's called money. Now, I will not try to put a guilt trip on any one of you who may have purchased a super lotto ticket, hoping to win $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion with a B dollars. That just blows me away to think that there was some jackpot that was going to be worth that. But I can tell you this, the world went crazy for that, right? That's what you heard about. You were getting these, we were getting these regular updates as to how much it was going up. And we saw news reports of lines of people standing in front of 7-Elevens and all kinds of other sort of places to buy their super lotto ticket, hoping to be the winner of $1.5 billion. Why? Because people valued $1.5 billion and figured that life would be great after that. In the midst of all the hoopla, I read an article that was put out that Mark Cuban actually gave some advice. Now, Mark Cuban is the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. If you watch the TV show Shark Tank, you know Mark Cuban is I think he's a very insightful businessman. And based upon what he said, I even give him a whole lot more credit. Let me read you what Mark Cuban said about the $1.5 billion Super Powerball lottery. He said, if you win, the first thing you should do is hire a tax attorney. That was pretty smart advice. Second thing he said, don't take the lump sum. You don't want to blow it all in one spot. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'd have taken it all in one lump sum, because I don't think I could have spent $1.5 billion even after taxes in one spot, but I kind of get where he's going. It was the next thing that he said, which I thought was so insightful. Listen to what Mark Cuban, an absolute, as far as I know, unbeliever, said. If you weren't happy yesterday, you won't be happy tomorrow. It's money, not happiness. Wow. When I read that, I said, Mark Cuban, you got it right. He goes on to say in the next one, though, I like this. The other side of that coin, he said, if you were happy yesterday, you're going to be a lot happier tomorrow. It is money. Life gets easier when you don't have to worry about all the bills. So I thought, that was good advice. So I would have been happier, by the way. I was happy the day before. I would have been happier, but I didn't win. I didn't play, so I didn't have a chance to win. But I just thought, how interesting. And it led me to, again, do a Google search, which I had seen things like this before. But I found a lot of articles. The title of the one I have in front of me is The Curse of the Lottery: Tragic Stories of Big Jackpot Winners. I won't bore you with the list of 10 that I have here in front of me. But there were 10 jackpot winners winning everything from the low of $1 million to as high as over $30-40 million. Nobody got one of the Powerballs. But in every case of these 10 in the story, there was a tragic ending. Some of them were shot by their family. Some of them committed suicide. Virtually all of them lost all of their money. I mean, you think of somebody winning $30 million, you think that person is set for life. Nope. Not so much. Because what Mark Cuban said was so true. If you weren't happy yesterday, you won't be happy today. It's money, not happiness. What do we value in life? Sometimes, once again, I'm afraid we value some of the most worthless things in life. When I look at the story of David and Mephibosheth, I understand that David valued life more than anything in his reign. Now you might say to me, well, Pastor, now wait a minute. Last week we talked about all the killings that David had. I mean, how could he believe in the sanctity of life and yet murder 60,000 people in chapter 8 alone? I mean, how could he do that? Because they were the enemies of God. He was doing it on the behest of God as those who had rejected the word. I mean, there is a difference between, again, valuing God's name and what God called him to do. But in chapter 9, we see a very clear picture that for King David, it really was all about people. And in this particular instance, a person. You know, Mephibosheth will illustrate for us the most needy. I'm going to jump actually to point 2 if you're going to follow in your outlines. I'm going to jump to point 2 before I do point 1. David sought the most needy. Mephibosheth demonstrates for us a person who could do nothing on their own. I mean, you talk about the most vulnerable or the most abused, the person that was who had the most need. Here was this young son of Jonathan, the grandson of King Saul. And he had a great need because he was crippled. Go backwards to chapter 4, if you would, in this book, just to look at the one verse that's recorded. We've already passed by it months ago, but just to remind us, when Saul was killed on the battlefield and David was taking over, and there was this internal strife going on, and David was, of course, getting stronger, and his kingdom was getting more and more established. It says in chapter 4 of verse 4, then Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was not born handicapped. He was not born crippled in the feet. It happened when the nurse was running out of the house with him. Why would she run out of the house? Because she assumed that the new king on the throne would do what most new kings did. They would kill all of the predecessor's family. She just assumed that as soon as David learned about this son of Jonathan, that he would search him down, he would kill him, because he didn't want any other threat to his throne. And so in her haste, she apparently dropped him, and he became lame. He was a cripple. You know, sometimes because we live in a society that has done a very good job over the last number of years to make society much more adaptable to the handicapped, we forget maybe what it must have been like for Mephibosheth. He didn't have ramps headed up into a building. He didn't have handicapped bathrooms. When I go to countries, some of the countries I go to, it's a good illustration to me that the rest of the world, to be handicapped and to be paralyzed is much more difficult than here. They don't have ways to get your wheelchair around and all the rest of it. Mephibosheth's life, when he became paralyzed, when he became a cripple, his life was pretty useless to most people. To most people, Mephibosheth became the offscouring of society. He became the non-person. I mean, there would have been many within the culture of Mephibosheth's day that would have just forgotten who he was, and they would have never reached out to him or helped him. So in the time in between chapter 4 and chapter 9, at least 20-some years have gone by. Mephibosheth's life had probably gotten very difficult. I mean, he was living as an orphan. He was living as a one hiding away from the king. I mean, Mephibosheth's life was not a life that any of us would have wanted to have lived. So when you read in chapter 9 that David wanted to reach out to Mephibosheth, do not think of the end of the story when you begin the story. Because if there's another word that could be described of Mephibosheth, it is he was fearful. Because he assumed someday the king would come to kill him. You know, it has been said of our country, and I believe this to be true, the most dangerous place to live in America is in the womb. Because there are more children that die in utero than by any other method every year in the United States of America. We can talk about gun control, we can talk about murder, we can talk about mobs, we can talk about all we want to try to protect life, but where we could really protect life, over 1 million every year, is to stop invading what was to be the most safe place in the world, in a mother's womb, and quit killing those children. But we don't. They are the most needy. They are the most vulnerable. And yes, they are the most fearful. If you don't believe me, you go home and Google videos about abortions that are taken, and you will watch, in late-term abortions, you will watch the baby do everything they can to get away from those probes that are being stuck in there to kill the baby. There is some sense of fear. There is certainly a sense of pain. Mephibosheth would have felt all of those things. But now I want to go back to point 1, because it says David remembered a promise. We sang today the song Ancient Words. Again, it's on my top 10 list. If I drop over dead today, my family is to use that in my funeral. That and about 20 other songs that we've, my funeral is going to be about 2 hours long. So, because I just want all these songs. And I love that song. Every time we sing it, I just think of how these ancient words have truly been passed down to us. It's just a great song. And it talks about the fact that God made promises. And that's why we spend time reading. That's why I will all year remind you should be reading 4 chapters a day. Today, I think you're supposed to be at around Exodus 16, I think, today. I'm going to put up every week. Josh made up a really neat little thing we're going to put up on Facebook, and I'll tweet it out to all you followers of me, all 22 of you. And but anyway, I'll tweet it out. I'll put it up on Facebook. He'll put it up on Facebook. I mean, I am going to remind you every week how you doing with your 4 chapters. Unless you want to get tired of me saying that, I suggest you read 4 chapters a day. Or just come and know that I'm going to ask you that, and you're going to go, I don't care. But the one time you could read through the Bible all in 1 year. In fact, you'll be done by the middle of October if you follow with me. Middle of October, you'll be all the way through. All of it. All the begats and all of the genealogies and some of that really boring stuff, But my point is that as you read, though, here's what you do. You take note of the promises of God. And you say, God, those promises you will fulfill to the people to whom you gave them. David made a promise. You need to go back to 1 Samuel chapter 20. Many years earlier, when both Jonathan and David were still young men. 1 Samuel chapter 20. David and Jonathan, we know they were dear friends. Why I think is a really good question to ask ourselves. I mean, it's kind of crazy that the young man who had been anointed to be the next king was going to be friends of the son of the man who was currently the king, which meant that he would never become king. And yet they were dear friends. Chapter 20, jump in at verse 13. It says this, "If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more so, if I do not make it known to you and send you away that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies." And Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Jonathan and David made a promise. Jonathan and David made a pact together. Yea, they made a covenant together. And David said, "I will forever show loving kindness to the house of King Saul." Jonathan knew, he didn't know how or when or any of the rest of it, but Jonathan knew that there would be a day that he would die and that David would sit on the throne, and he asked of David to show loving kindness to his family. David made the promise that I'll do it. Again, they made a covenant. They made a very binding covenant. And David remembered that covenant. When David's kingdom was being established, as it was being extended into areas around the world, as his armies were getting victory after victory, as David's house of his royalty was getting stronger and stronger, David remembered a promise that he had made. And his promise was, "I will show loving kindness." You know, we have to stop for just a minute, and that's going to lead us to point number 3. But we need to stop and we have to think about the word loving kindness. You know, first of all, I need you to stop and ask yourself, when you think about what you value, I need you to ask yourself, what did you promise the Lord? If you think back to the day that you trusted Christ as your Savior, and especially those early years after that, I mean, what were the kinds of things you promised to the Lord? Oh, I'm sure you promised Him that you would follow Him the rest of your life and you would tell people about Him. And I'm sure you told the Lord that, well, Lord, I'll read your word and I'll pray and I'll serve you. And I mean, I'm sure we made all kinds of promises. But the longer life goes, sometimes we tend to forget those promises. We tend to have amnesia, sometimes on purpose. We just choose to forget them. We choose to say, I'm not going to live up to them. That wasn't King David. King David made a promise and he knew that it was time to fulfill it. He knew that it was finally time to demonstrate that his word was his bond. And so David responded with grace. Again, in chapter 9, at least 4 times in this passage, David said he will show kindness. It's a great Hebrew word. It's the word chesed. And that word is used hundreds of times. And it's a word that is very difficult to translate. In the New Testament, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, they tried to find a word that would match it, and so they would often use the word that we have in the New Testament for grace. So the word chesed can mean grace, but it's one of those words that is just so packed with meaning. It's almost impossible to translate into another language. It's that way in English. It's that way with any language. There are certain words that you just can't You just can't get it one word to one word. I've often said that's why when I go, and especially Thailand, it always seems like it's worse there. But when I'm talking, and I'm being translated, and I go blah, 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 blah. And then the translator goes blah, 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 blah. And I'll say to them sometimes afterwards, what in the world were you doing? Well, you used this word, and we don't really have that, so I had to explain it. And you're like, yeah, okay. and the word chesed is kind of that way. I looked it up, and again, in some of our lexicons, there's just a whole paragraph of various and sundry words to use for it. In some of our translations, it's the word loving kindness. Some of our translations, it's mercy. Some of our translations, it's just like this, kindness. Sometimes it's just translated by love and loving kindness. There's just all kinds of it's like a diamond, as it were. There's just multiple facets of the word. But for this morning, let's just go ahead and use the word kindness. Kindness for us is a pretty weak word, isn't it? Kindness to us are things like, you don't kick your dog, and maybe you help an old lady across the street, or maybe an old man. Old men need to get helped across the street too, But sometimes that's kind of the depth of our kindness. And that's why it's a little hard, but we're going to use that word anyway. David showed kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now, just try to imagine for a minute that you're Mephibosheth. And you're hiding out, and you have been for over 20 years. You're crippled in the feet. You probably haven't gotten out much. But all of a sudden, you're hearing kind of through the grapevine that David is looking for you. What would you conclude? I will just about guarantee to you, if you were Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth himself would not conclude this, woohoo! He's going to make me a son of his and I get to eat at his table. He would not have concluded that. He would have concluded, well, it's been 20 years, it's been a good run, but here comes David. He's going to come, he's going to take my life, he's going to finally do to me what he probably should have done 20 years ago. He should have eliminated the one threat left for his throne, since I'm the grandson of King Saul. But in David's heart, it was just the opposite. For David, it was kindness. For David, it was a loving response to a promise that he had made. And King David responded in that way. He demonstrated kindness to this man. Why? Because he valued life. Again, here was Mephibosheth. He was crippled. He was an orphan. He couldn't take care of himself. He had no way to respond, as it were, to many aspects of life. He was certainly one of the most needy in the culture. I read a quote by Joni Eareckson Tada, who obviously, if you know who she is, she knows a little bit about difficulties in life. She said this, if you truly believe in the value of life, you care about all of the weakest and the most vulnerable members of society. You care about the weakest, the most vulnerable in society. For David, Mephibosheth reflected one of those. For us, it isn't just the unborn. It really is people in our culture who have needs beyond which any of us can even imagine. That's why those years that our team went out to Georgia and worked in the camp out there. That's why some of us have been involved, not me particular, but just some in our church have been involved with Joni Eareckson Tada's ministry in a very one-on-one way, because we recognize that there are some people in our world who they are valued, though the world would say they have little value. Like I say, in other cultures, if you have a handicap, you are just persona non grata. That's why many years ago, the hospital in Bangladesh, they have worked very diligently at building prostheses for folks who have lost their legs and their arms. I mean, I remember the first time Nancy took me into the workshop where they build these things. It was kind of creepy, actually, because they have these bins, and inside the bins are these feet that they have made, and there's all these feet, and you're kind of like, oh, that kind of, you got to keep telling yourself they're rubber, they're not. And but they have worked very diligently to build these prostheses, and it gives people who no longer have a foot or a leg or whatever, it's given them the opportunity to be as normal as they can. And they did it because they value life. David valued Mephibosheth's life. And he said, it's about time I return the favor and that God has shown me, and I'm going to show kindness to Mephibosheth. Again, when you're in verse 6 and Mephibosheth comes and he prostrates himself, he's doing that because he has concluded that David will take his life. And that's exactly why at verse 7 David said, don't fear. He wouldn't have told him, don't fear. He wouldn't have said to him, stop fearing, if he had nothing to fear, if he hadn't come in with fear. But he did, and David restores him. David shows him grace and mercy. I mean, let me take you to a passage that I want to go to the book of James in chapter 4. There's a little phrase in James chapter 4 I want us to just take just a minute to think about life. Again, we read Psalm 139. And by the way, it would have been okay to have gone ahead and had us read all the verses, even if they were meant to be left out, just to let you know that. The Lord wants you to have us read all the verses or verses before or after. You just go right ahead. That may just be the Lord leading you. But anyway, Psalm 139 is that great passage where it talks about we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We are knit together. I mean, we have taken times on these Sanctity of Human Life Sundays. We have taken times in the years gone by to just really look at all those words and how intimate it is, and that whole knitting together thing, and just that God puts together our bodies. I mean, once again, sometimes we ask ourselves, God, how could you have put that body together? But God says, I have made all the bodies. I have fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, there is a great lessons in that passage. But James asks a question that I think gets at the heart also of this question we have before us. Verse 13, chapter 4 of the book of James. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city to spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not even know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or do that. But as it is, your boast in arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. In verse 14, our life is a vapor, and it appears for a little while and vanishes away. Again, the idea here is in verse 14, some of the translations will say, instead of what is your life, it just says that it breaks it out as an actual question. What is your life? I jotted for myself a number of things that are right here in the passage. Number one, we're just a mist. We're just a vapor. It's here and gone. Other passages of Scripture describes our life as a shadow. It comes and goes. Describes our life as swift. Job said life is short. I had the privilege to be a part of a funeral yesterday for a man who was 90 years old when he passed away. 90, that's long. I mean, that's a long time to live, but in eternity, 90? Not very long. I've often said this, and maybe some of you will remember. I have said that one of my first messages I ever preached was entitled The 2-Hour Life. The 2-hour life. Because the scriptures tell us that Peter says that 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord, right? It's just a comparison. It's not real, but this is what I did. I said, okay, if 1,000 years is like a day, let's just do some math. 1,000 years equals 24 hours. 100 years equals 2.4 hours. 80 years is 2 hours. In eternity, compared to eternity, if you live to be 80, you live 2 hours. Thank you very much. If you get to live to be 90 or 100, okay, you get an extra half an hour. The question is, what are you doing with it? If I told you right now, every person in this room will be dead in 2 hours. By 2 o'clock this afternoon, every one of us would be dead. I'll guarantee you'll change your agenda for the day. You won't go to lunch today at McDonald's. You will not go get fast food. You might go down to Forbes Mill and spend $150 on lunch. Because doggone it, your last one. You might decide to make a phone call to a loved one that you haven't talked to in years. You may decide, if you're here without Christ, you may decide that if you know for sure by 2 o'clock you'll be dead, you'll make sure you trust Christ as your Savior now. But here's what I can tell you. I'll make a dogmatic statement. In light of eternity, in 2 hours from now, everyone in this room will be dead. Now that statement won't change many of your actions. Because you'll say, yeah, okay, Pastor, I get it. But I'm only X. I'm only 30, so I got a lot of time. And I'm 60. Well, I don't have so much time. I'm 80. Woo! Time's going by really fast. Miss Ina, I'm 102. Oh. Wow. We know you don't have much time left, you know what I'm saying? Well, time is short. And the origin of life, God made it. Go back to the book of Genesis. God breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. We didn't evolve from a primordial sea in by some chance of history. God created us. God created life. And we are responsible to Him. Life is purposeful. Every one of us will die. Various things will happen to us. I mean, life is unpredictable. But what's very predictable is that we will die. And my question to us today is, again, what are we going to do with it? I read a great article about Mephibosheth. Here was the title of the article. Having a Mephibosheth Ministry. I thought, well, that was an interesting title. Having a Mephibosheth Ministry. You can kind of probably gather from that title what he meant. He said, how many of us invite people over to our table to eat? To show them loving kindness and the grace of God. He said, we all should have some type of a Mephibosheth ministry. Reaching out to the most needy, the most vulnerable. And by the way, we could certainly, I think, agree that actually the most needy in our culture are those who are living without Christ. Those who have physical, emotional, financial problems, they are not the most needy. The most needy are those who are living without Christ. Someone suggested we should have a Mephibosheth ministry. Another title was this, The Tablecloth of Grace. The Tablecloth of Grace. Chuck Swindoll used that title. I love that. I thought that was a great title. Because his point was, come over to verse 12 And he says, Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he ate at the king's table regularly. He suggested that it was possible that there was this beautiful tapestry of a tablecloth, and when it fell off to the side of the table, it covered Mephibosheth's crippled feet. A tablecloth of grace. There are the needy in our world. There are needy in our church. There are people who have physical and other kinds of needs that God could use you and use me to meet. There are people like Mephibosheth around us. And if we made a promise to God that we would reach out to them in mercy and grace, it's about time we do that. Maybe it's the time that we need to extend mercy and grace. One of the key factors in the Hebrew word chesed is a covenant, is a pact. It sort of has within it, built within it, this idea of a sort of a reciprocating notion that you've been shown mercy, now you show mercy. Some of you have seen the video I want to show. It sort of made its rounds. It stuck out to me because it's actually a commercial from Thailand. And I want you to watch it, and I want you to ask yourself, can you be this kind to people?
Mẹป่วยเหรออย่าทำอย่างนี้อีกนะหน่วยเกาเหลาจ่อนั่งเลยครับนั่งเลยป๊าจัดไปอ้าวสั่งมาเร็วต่ออะไร